So Greg here, who's a real Cape Townian, is going to show you how to get to the slides for this talk. So if you type Philip into Google, just the word Philip, I spell it with one L. It'll work with two. My home page comes up number 1. I'm pretty easy to find. I don't have business cards anymore. Now if you go under Teaching, and then under Miscellaneous Short Talks, ignore the helicopter talk up at the top. I teach helicopter flying also. Let me tell you, when you're at 500 feet and you turn off the engine, the student in the helicopter pays much more attention than the student at MIT. Here are the slides. All right, so Derek sent me email saying, Philip, you know, Bono and Richard Branson and Peter Gabriel are going to be introducing the speakers by video. You know, who famous can we get to introduce you? And I said, you know, Derek, I'm a computer programmer. There's nobody famous that would want to know me. But then I realized I do have a connection to the famous folks there. So see on the right, that's my cousin Douglas. And he's responsible for educating Americans about African culture and natural history and wildlife. He's one of the most important educators, actually, in America about things African, because he was one of the animators of the lion Scar in the movie The Lion King. So he used to work at Walt Disney in Burbank, California. And being an animator in Hollywood is kind of like being a computer programmer at an insurance company. These guys are the bottom of the food chain, and he didn't even bother to usually take a shower or shave before he went to work. So he goes, the backstory of this is he got very interested in genealogy. And he started tracing our family's history, which of course was not very illustrious, back many generations and then forward. He was staying up till 4 in the morning, telephoning people in Africa and Argentina and driving his wife crazy. And he found all kinds of sixth cousins, thrice removed, twice forcibly. So one of the people he finds, who's a cousin of ours, maybe in Argentina, has a last name of Shatner. So I assume a lot of you folks have seen the old Star Trek TV show, and there's William Shatner as Captain James T. Kirk. So Doug's in Burbank, California, remember, and he goes to this espresso shop before he goes to work. So he hasn't shaved, and he's in rumpled animator-type clothes. And right in front of him in line is a guy. It's a long line, too. Very hard to get out of this line. There's a guy wearing a baseball cap pulled down really low over his eyes and sunglasses, trying not to be recognized. And Doug says, "Hey, you're William Shatner, aren't you?" The guy says, No. It's like, "I know it. You're William Shatner." And the guy says, No. Doug says, "You're William Shatner." The guy finally admits it. Okay, I'm William Shatner, you're right. Takes off his glasses, and Doug says, "Guess what? We're related." So I emailed William Shatner, but he did not agree to do the video introduction. All right. So we're going to talk about online communities. Greg, you can sit down now if you like. Why are we talking about online communities? We're talking about them because they are at the heart of almost all successful and revolutionary Internet applications. If you look at eBay, if you look at America Online, Amazon.com, Flickr, most of the popular services that get a lot of usage, other than personal communications like email, are online communities. Well, why is that? Internet is not useful unless you're separated in space and time. So if you have a bunch of people like we are here and we're together in a room, we don't really need the Internet to collaborate. We can just talk to each other. If we're not separated in time, we can use the telephone. So the killer applications of the Internet turn out to be coordinating people who are separated in space and time. Instead of considering all possible kinds of online communities, like the commercial ones such as Amazon or eBay, let's stick to ones that are centered around learning and education. I think that a lot of those are very enduringly popular. We saw that yesterday when Jimmy Wales talked about how popular Wikipedia was. That testifies, I think, to the enduring power of human curiosity and the desire to learn more. Okay, why does education matter? There was an old president of MIT, Carl Taylor Compton. In 1938, he said that with science, for the first time, we have a way of securing a more abundant life, which does not simply consist in taking away from someone else. So we can make everybody's life better without just transferring treasure from one group to another. Economic growth comes from technology innovation, and you really can't apply science and engineering without education. So if you want economic growth, basically most of it, particularly in the more advanced societies, comes from education. Okay. If education leads to better technology, does better technology lead to better education? So I guess Bobby was just saying that people are not going to fund this anymore. They don't believe that technology leads to better education. People have tried, though, and almost universally, the plan for applying technology to education has been to take the great teachers and put them into cans, and then ship the cans to more students. So you might say, well, Reg here is a great teacher at UWC, but unfortunately, only 25 students at a time can learn from him. So let's take Reg, we'll put him in a can, and we'll ship him out. And this idea actually started in the 1950s. In the U.S., when television came out, people said, this is going to be great, because every evening on the big channels, they're going to have lectures from Harvard and Yale, and everybody in the U.S. will be as educated as if they'd gone to these Ivy League schools. So what have the shipping mechanisms been for the canned lectures by Reg? Well, in the old days, they were closed-circuit television. Stanford used to ship out the lectures by closed-circuit TV. And then in the 60s, the Chinese came up with a brilliant idea of, actually in the 70s, they were going to ship the canned Beijing University lectures all over China by satellite TV. In the 80s, we had the VHS videotape. In the 90s, people said, oh, we're going to just revolutionize the world. We're going to ship the cans over Internet. Streaming video. It hasn't really, you walk around, there's still people who are as dumb as bricks. And in the U.S. anyway, they all have Internet connections, so it's not working. What if we turn the system around and we say, we use the technology not to increase the number of students for those great teachers, but we increase the number of teachers. So most people don't want to teach full-time. It's very annoying. Most students, this is what you realize when you're a university professor. 85% of your students are not in the classroom because they want to be excellent at the subject that you're teaching. They can have a lot of reasons to be in your class. They want to get a grade. They think it'll look good on their transcript. Their parents told them to take the class. It fulfills some requirement. So basically, for those 85%, their goal is to be a mediocre engineer, especially, at least in your topic, with an MIT degree, for example, and a fat job. And I often have to say to them, why do I get up in the morning to come in here and teach you? You're already mediocre. You don't need me to achieve your goal. So most people will not want to do a full-time teaching job because it is so annoying. However, a lot of people have a few hours a week where they really enjoy teaching. It can be rewarding, particularly when you're helping people. So, and it's actually easy to learn in weird little hours. If it's 3 in the morning and you want to learn about quantum mechanics, you just pull a book off the shelf. But if it's 3 in the morning and you start calling up your friends and try to teach them about quantum mechanics, they probably won't be too happy that you called. What does it take to be a useful teacher? Do you need to be the world's biggest expert? Do you need to be Reg in the can shipped out to all these eager people who've been starved of his lectures for so many years? You don't need to be the world's leading expert. You just need to know more than the person who asked the question. So if there are 6 billion people in the world, on any given topic, there are 5.999 billion potential teachers, depending on who's asking the question. So that's what online communities are all about. I'll give you a little bit of personal history. I started building internet applications in the early 1980s, and I always thought that the most interesting usage of computers would be coordinating people over the internet. Then in the early 90s, the web came out, and I thought, well, now I'll build this with a web interface. I'm embarrassed to say it, but my early applications were all built on the MIT Lisp machine, which was not a very popular operating system. People who use the Macintosh, they think they're rebels because there's only, 5 million Macs out there or whatever. But I think the Lisp machine production reached about 3,000. So there were 3,000 potential users of the things that I had built. But with the web, suddenly there were tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands very quickly. So one of the things I did was started publishing some stories that I'd written and some photos. And I thought the web, one great thing about publishing on the web is that it gets us back to a world of multiple perspectives where it's not just one writer's opinion, which is kind of a literate way of looking at the world. You know, in pre-literate societies, you don't have the idea that there's going to be one canonical text and that everybody has to think the same way. I think that internet gets us back to that, where you can have, a travel guide to Cape Town and comments from readers that really significantly enrich it. So I was working on that. I got a lot of questions about photography. The more I published photos and stories, people were asking, well, how did you take that picture, and what kind of equipment would I need to do the same thing? So I wrote a lot of tutorial articles on photography, thinking that would stop the questions. But it's an open-ended subject, and of course people would ask more. So then I started a Q&A forum. I thought, well, they'll ask the question, I'll answer it, it'll be public. I'll provide a provision for other people to add their answers. And then people won't ask the same question more than once because they'll see it in the archives. Very quickly, though, I discovered that, Reader A was answering Reader B's question, and I didn't have to do much besides moderate a little bit. Okay, so I've been involved since then in building about 200 online communities, either helping with the original design or actually doing some coding or some content on them. And I've looked at, of course, a bunch more on the public internet, and I'm going to share with you a few things that I've learned about building sustainable online communities. So there's 6 required elements. The first thing you need is you got to have magnet content authored by experts. So give people some reason to come to the site. So here's an article on portrait photography that I wrote. I don't know if it's the greatest article ever, but it talks about different kinds of portraits, going on location. There's my friend Tom at the blackjack tables in Vegas. He was playing $500 a hand, and then sometimes he would split it, so he was losing, he would lose $1,000 in 30 seconds, and I knew he could afford it, but it was so painful to watch. I still remember that. Anyway, lighting, what kind of lens do you need? Got to get me some of those condoms, since we're not getting our share of internet. But anyway, have a look at the scroll bar there on the right. Notice that the reader's comments come in. Only about a third of the content on this page is stuff that I wrote. And the readers, they can upload their own photos. We'd be able to see that. The network, we're a little more cooperative. Okay, so you have magnet content authored by the publisher to get things kicked off. Answer forum. There's a whole bunch of them now on photo.net, and I'll talk about when you have a big community. We'll talk about this later. How many forums should you have? So here's one on digital darkroom. How do I do this? That's a great subject line. Let me show you an example of what I think is a productive exchange. So if you go out and use black and white film on a day with a blue sky and some puffy white clouds, it turns out that the film sees the blue sky and the white clouds as approximately the same tone. So they come out not very interesting on film. It just is a big white sky. So one thing you can do is put a red filter over the lens, and that'll darken the blue sky while leaving the white cloud relatively untouched. So there's a question at 1 in the morning from a guy, and he says he tried this and it didn't work. So 1:30 he gets a response, At 5:38 p.m., he's gotten a response. It's not quite loading, but I think you can sort of see it. See, there's no filters there, and there's not much separation between the clouds and the sky. And then there's some, with a green filter and an orange filter, the sky is getting darker and darker. So there's 6. Most of our readers are single guys. Here's a sequence I did a while ago, taking pictures of my airplane on a cloudy day. So we don't get a lot of questions about wedding photography. Okay, do we trust this guy? One thing you have to have is a way of assessing people's credibility. The best way to do it is just by looking at what they posted before. So he's been a community member since January 1999. He's posted 2,200 forum postings. We can read them if we like. We can look at some of his photos on his gallery. We can go over to his personal web page. So he's identified. That's his real name. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I'm not into the anonymous mudslinging. This is kind of something I stuck in there in the old days. Now it's kind of obvious that you don't want to wear the community out with repetitive questions. So you need some way for people to find the old questions and answers. With Google, this is no longer much of an issue. But when Photo.net started in 1993, we had to have our own local search engine. Okay, delegation of moderation. Unless you want to go all commercial from the moment that you start, but even then, if you have to pipe all contributed content through one person, that person is going to get very tired, very worn out, and is going to demand a full-time salary. It's going to become a full-time job. If, on the other hand, you can do a database query and say, show me the most active contributors, show me what they've written, and then invite those folks to become moderators, then you have the beginnings of sustainability, because now you can just spread the workload. So on Photo.net, we've got about 20 volunteer moderators, and the site wouldn't be able to work without them. There's about 570,000 registered users. Probably 20,000 are really active, and keeping those the discussion focused takes about 20 moderators, each of whom is probably only working 5 or 10 hours a week. You need to identify members who are imposing an undue burden on the community, and you need to change their behavior by talking to them, or you need to exclude them. This was the problem with Usenet. Those of you who are really old may remember the old Usenet discussion groups, and they didn't work very well because there was no authentication, and lots of spammers came in there and other people who were disruptive, and there was no way to get rid of them. But on a website, where you have authentication and login, you can. If you don't have really good means for authenticating folks, then you need some way of getting rid of them so they can't just come back and re-register under a new name from a new IP address. So what we did at Photo.net, there's 2 ways to do this that I think are pretty good. One thing I did was I put in like a 20-second delay on every page load from the people that I didn't like. So they would just say, the server's really slow, I don't like using it anymore, and they would go away. The more clever thing to do probably would be to, since every page is generated with a relational database query in SQL, just query if they post something and they've been banned but don't realize it, just show them what they posted but don't show it to anybody else. So they think to themselves, God, I thought that comment about Hitler would really get people going, and nobody responded. Means of software extension by community members themselves. That's kind of odd. So does that mean every user is a programmer? No, but it means every programmer is a user. So let's think about this. The Microsoft way of doing things, which is pretty much the way everybody else does it, is you've got the marketing person who says, Greg, what do you need? And Simon, where's Simon? Hey, he's there. What do you need? So then you write all that down. You give it to the product manager. The product manager tries to come up with some reasonable schedule and set of features. Then there's the programmers who are in a dark room by themselves. They don't really have any personal interest in the product. They just crank it out in a language like C++ or Java that requires a lot of professional training. And then, they throw the CD over the wall, and then it gets shipped out to customers. And, maybe after about 4 or 5 of these cycles, the customer gets something fairly reasonable. That hasn't worked very well in Internet applications. If you look at the applications that were built in those brittle languages like C++, where if you try to change one page, you might break the whole application, they turned out not to be adaptive enough. The software that you need for 5 people is very different than the software you'll need for 50, for 500, for 50,000. You know, I see this when my students in the software engineering class at MIT, I teach a lab course sometimes, and you know, they'll build pages that show every like to pick a user, they'll have a drop-down box that has every registered user in the system. And I say, well, that's a good interface now, but you know, as the community grows, a drop-down box with 500,000 items on it is not going to be very convenient. So basically, you need to adapt, and that means the programmers who are on the project have to be users. You know, if it's a gardening site, if it's a site about romance, you're not going to get any C++ programmers who would be potential users. But if you lower the skill level required to maybe PHP or Visual Basic or some other scripting language, then you probably can get people who might find love potentially. I don't think I could love a PHP programmer, but who knows? I'm going to talk about more of that stuff, actually, the nuts and bolts in a 2 o'clock talk. I don't think anybody's going to come because Brian Bellendorf is going to be giving a much more interesting talk in here, but it's in the little room for the loser speakers. If you want to learn about why the relational database SQL and the scripting language have been king in web development, everybody uses it. Amazon, eBay, all these folks are doing scripting. Because basically the real engineering comes in the data model and the page flow, and the actual pages are just gluing an HTML template to stuff that comes from the database. So these fancy computer languages don't help too much. Okay, so what are the obvious things you can add to Usenet? Usenet was a pretty decent online community. Once you go to the web, you can add a lot of email integration. I think that's led to a lot of increased usage. You can have the collaborative moderation like we talked about. Full text indexing, secure transmission if you want to have a private forum. Getting rid of the burdensome people turned out to be the most dramatic. Let's look at Usenet a little bit. Raise your hand if you haven't seen these old Usenet groups, which now people probably call Google groups. So is this new to anybody here? Everybody seen Usenet? Come on. I see some young people here. All right. So here's the question in rec.aviation.soaring. So it was categorized by, this was rec. There was also SOC, S-O-C. Brian, you're ancient. What were the other ones? Science? Alt, yeah. Yeah, I know you guys were probably surfing the alt directories a lot. Rec.aviation.soaring. So it's recreational, it's in aviation, and this is for sailplanes, people who like to fly with no engine. So here's the guy who wants to put an emergency locator transmitter in his Discus 2, and he doesn't know where to put it because it's all carbon fiber. So he gets some answers. On the DB2, left side on the seat back bulkhead. So that's a pretty good answer. He got it 4:49 p.m. I don't know, within a few hours, certainly in less than a day. So that actually is a pretty productive group. People actually help each other. They probably don't have a lot of spam. A lot of the Usenet groups became very problematic. And it's interesting. You can see a lot. There's this interesting Microsoft site, which is linked to from the slides, which you can get to. It's a way of looking at different forums. So you can see, like, how many people posted in a given forum. I guess this is probably in a 17-day period here. How many of those were returnees from the previous month? It's interesting. There were 8,700 in Israel, but a lot of them were new. Europe was a tighter community. And you can look at the variation of repliers. Anyway, let's search for soaring. So if we look at a group like the soaring group, there's a lot of interesting metrics you can apply. You can infer a lot from people's behavior. So what does a spammer look like? A spammer looks like somebody who never replies. He never answers a question. And he's very interested in many topics. He's posting in 5,000 groups. So that's a spammer. What about a person who is argumentative? Think about a thread. That thread that we looked at in soaring had 7 replies. Think about a thread with 125 replies. What could that be? that's got to be a flame war of some kind, right? There's very, very few questions that merits 124 answers. So somebody who participates in that, if you don't know anything about them, you can't really authenticate them, but you can just tell if they've participated in a lot of really long threads that they're probably just there for the purpose of arguing. So if you look at these forums in the aggregate, you can get a lot of information about what kind of people are in there, how many one-time posters. You can look at the different threads. So this forum is doing pretty well. There's not too many threads that erupted into a huge number of posts. Anyway, so NetScan is interesting. Microsoft Research has a group of sociologists that work there, and they've done a lot of pretty clever stuff with Usenet. But I don't think it's enough. All right, let's talk a little bit about how do we scale these communities up? Because it's pretty easy if you have people who really need to be in a discussion group, it's pretty easy to get something going, a simple mailing list or a simple discussion forum. First of all, most people think of Internet as a good place for anonymous interaction. You pick a screen name, you pick an age, and you pick a sex. And then you go out there online, and I say, well, I'd really like to be a 14-year-old girl. Actually, I took some horse riding lessons, and I decided that what I really needed to be was a 10-year-old girl because they were all pretty good at riding the horse, and I was not. So, yeah, I go on there and say, I'm a 10-year-old girl. I like to ride horses. And that's what Internet's all about. I don't think that's really very effective. It might be a good commercial model that's worked for America Online, but it doesn't work for me at Photo.net. That's not the kind of thing I'm interested in running. And the real world isn't like that. You don't have a good discussion where everybody's hidden behind a wall and they're not responsible for anything they said, and they can change their sex, and they can change their name, and they can come back and kiss all their history goodbye. So in the real world, the best communities are ones where people are identified. You can tell how old they are, what sex they are, where they live. They're authenticated. They can't lie about their name or their background. And they're accountable. If they said something 4 weeks ago, they can't re-register with the world and come back and expunge their history. So that's one thing you can do is verify people's names, either through a chain of trust. You mark the 15 people on the site that you happen to know, and you give them the authority to mark other people that they know as authentic. Another thing you can do is add some facilities for audience reaction. So I built Photo.net. Actually, when I arrived here, some of the folks in the CS department, they're like, Philip, how do you feel? I said, what do you mean? They said, there's this Korean guy back in the U.S., and he's some kind of programmer type, and he had a lot of guns, and he kept to himself, and he didn't do that well with women. I said, what did Jin do? My friend Jin S. Choi, so we built Photo.net together. Anyway, so if you're, let's say you're giving a talk at Virginia Tech right now, and you believe that every American should have the right to buy a machine gun, which we pretty much do, thank God. You're talking to a big crowd, and you're prepared to give a full 45-minute speech on the importance of the Second Amendment and gun rights. You discover that people aren't really enthusiastic about your message. And you'll pick that up in their faces, and you'll probably change your talk a little bit. But that doesn't happen online. If you send mail to a 100,000-person mailing list, it goes out. If they happen to be offended, if 10% of them happen to be offended, then you don't find out till it's too late. So what can you do in an online community? Well, there's a couple things you can do. One of them is, technologically, why not send it to a subset of the community first for a reaction? Mimic the real world. Is it really... Most things on Photo.net aren't that urgent that they need to be sent out immediately to all 570,000 users. You can also have a breakout chat room where people can try out their ideas. We did this at Photo.net with America Online Chat, AIM Chat, because it's free, and they have a good desktop client. It didn't work because if you're going to do a chat room, you have to do it off your own server with your own usernames, because if they go to a place like AOL, where they all have different usernames, they can't identify each other, and they don't know who people are. So I think that could work. Or emotionally charged involves some delay. So, for example, for a political campaign, you don't say, hey, it's Monday morning, we've decided to have a presidential election. Here are the candidates. And then on Tuesday, you can vote. It's a long, drawn-out process. If there's a trial for murder, we don't arrest somebody and then have the trial and then, try to have an execution at 4 p.m. so we can beat the traffic. It takes a long time to do some of these things. So why should just because the online world can be instant, does that mean it should be instant? It's particularly bad because a lot of people, if you look at photo.net, the first and second responses are often not that useful. The people who are first responders just tend to be loudmouths. So what do you do about that? Well, Harvard Law School has an interesting project. I think one of them is called the Rotisserie, if you Google for that. I linked to it, I think, I have an online textbook, Software Engineering for Internet Applications. It's on my site. It's all linked from there. That links to it, I think. Anyway, so what they do in a class, for a class discussion, is a question goes out, and then there's a period maybe of 6 or 8 hours during which people can answer, and then none of the answers are shown until the end of the period. And then they're shown in some kind of random order, not in the order in which they were written. So there's no value. You won't get any more readers if you happen to respond very quickly. You only get more readers if you respond more thoughtfully. Another to write something, and then another student is randomly assigned to respond to that posting. So every posting gets a response, and you're free to respond to other things, but it takes out some of the pressure to be outrageous. If you think about it, if there's 30 students in a class, you would get a lot more responses if you posted something outrageous. And you might get no responses if you posted something that was fairly sober. But this way, everything gets a response. So that has worked very well. Within about 6 months, I think we had 5,000 people who'd marked 25,000. It was launched quite a long time ago. 5,000 people marked 25,000 other readers and contributors as interesting. So that works. Let's talk a little bit about fragmentation of discussion. So on photo.net, let's go back to the forums. So we used to have one discussion forum. Then we said, we'll go here, this is a little better page. Then we said, well, that's not good enough. There's so many users now, it's becoming overwhelming. If I never go into the woods and take pictures of animals, why should I be reading postings about that? So here we have nature, travel, black and white film, lighting, and Canon EOS. Let's say I want to use a Canon EOS camera and a flash to take pictures of an animal in South Africa. So which of those 4 forums do I use? Do I do the Usenet thing and cross-post in chronological order? And then if you're not interested, say, and you never want to see anything from black and white photo, you can go over here and customize it and say, okay, I don't want to see that anymore. All these are sort of okay. This was all built. I actually showed this to some guys who raised a lot of money recently to do social networking sites, and they had a lot of programmers. They had a whole team from MySpace. I showed them sort of the back end of photo.net and some stuff we were doing, and they said, this is great Web 2.0 stuff. When did you build this? And I said, 1995. So that was okay in 1995, but I don't think it's really the right thing anymore. So I've come up with an idea which some smart young people like here at UWC should really implement. And I call it the solar magnitude forum idea. Reg has already heard this, unfortunately. But so there's going to be, in the photo.net database, there's a couple million, I think there's a couple million questions and answer threads. Okay, so that's like the stars in the sky. And what do you see when you're standing out on a dark night? You don't see every star because there's a lot of them in distant galaxies that we can't see, right? You see the objects in the universe that are either very close to us or they're very bright, like a supernova in a distant galaxy. That's very bright, even though it's far away. And we see the moon because it's very close, even though it's not very bright. Okay, how would that work in a discussion forum? Let us take photography, for example. So I say, well, I live in South Africa, and I'm a dinosaur, so I use a Nikon film camera. And I also have a Sinar large format camera because I want to have a cloth over my head and look like some leftover from the 19th century. And I like to take pictures with studio strobes with my view camera. So you kind of list what you're interested in. And then, so you define, each publisher would have to define multiple axes and then the positions on those axes. Then for every posting, you categorize the posting. If it's about the Canon EOS system in South Africa using a flash, well, then that is, going to be far away from Greg's interests on the camera brand scale because it's about Canon and not Nikon. But it's going to be close in South Africa on the geography and maybe close on the lighting question. So if he logs in, he's going to perhaps see that one because it's about South Africa. What about, let's say a photographer takes a sensational image over in Australia, and there's a big controversy about it. Well, and there's maybe a very interesting philosophical discussion about should this person have been able to take the image, should they be able to sell it, all that kind of stuff. Well, that's a very bright posting that other people have marked as very interesting, and it's a hot topic, so he should see that. Because even though it's far away and it's not related to his photographic interests, and it's a different brand of camera, that's a very bright thing. So basically, I think that's the right way to do discussion, and you also set it up so you can set the background. Say you're really bored and you're in a hotel somewhere on a business trip, you could turn down the background scatter so you can see a lot of postings from photo.net. But if you're at work, you can turn up the background illumination so you only see stuff that's really close to you and or really bright. So I think that's probably the best way to handle the community growth. I've never seen it done, but it really doesn't work very well the way the current internet is set up for busy people. So for example, in aviation, I've got a little airplane. I keep it at Hanscom Field in Boston. So I would have to join the Hanscom Field Pilots Association to find out what's happening at my local airport. And then I have a Cirrus, same plane as Angelina Jolie. And for those of you who follow American news, the New York Yankees pitcher Corey Lidle flew one into an apartment building about 6 months ago. Al-Qaeda style, but not with the same impact since it's just a 4-seater. There's a dentist who's 14 stories. You gotta love some of these New Yorkers. 14 stories above the apartment that was hit. He's suing the widow, saying that her dead husband made his apartment unlivable, that the damage from this little airplane crashing 14 floors below his apartment has rendered his apartment unlivable due to some kind of damage. Anyway, so I have that kind of little airplane, and there's a group for Cirrus owners, so we can trade stories about how to get things fixed. I'm also a flight instructor, so I could join a flight instructors group to talk about how best to teach students or difficult maneuvers. Sometimes I fly down to Mexico, and there's a group of pilots. There's a separate discussion forum for finding out about the best airports in Mexico and where you clear customs and that kind of thing. So basically, what the world needs is, in my opinion, is fewer discussion forums and something like the Solar Magnitude Forum. Since this is a talk about open source, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened with Photo.net. So we had this community that kind of grew up around 1995, and that was such an early period in the internet that people didn't agree on how you build internet applications. So we've kind of converged. I think the folks at Amazon, I was building a big information system for Children's Hospital in Boston. They used an Oracle database already, so it was natural to use a relational database there. Amazon.com did the same thing. That was all built on top of Oracle with some front-end pages. But people, a lot of people were using object databases or no database at all, and they were taking locks. Nobody was really thinking about how you manage the concurrency problem where you have 1,000 users at the same time trying to update something. So most internet sites, if you're trying to shop, you would get through the whole shopping process, and then when you tried to check out, it was broken. Or you would register somewhere and try to use something, and it would be very frustrating because there were so many software bugs. So I thought, well, maybe I can help these people. So I took all the software from Photo.net, tarred it up, documented it, and shipped it out. And a kid I was working with gave it the name Ars Digita. It's some piglet. I think it's actually a mixed word. I think it's half Greek and half Latin. But anyway, he made up this word, Ars Digita. Ars Digita community system. So we were giving it away so that other people who wanted to build similar online communities could start from a reasonably stable, known to be working code base. And it became very popular. A lot of online communities started with it. And then the big companies started calling. And the bigger, like Siemens would call and say, we want to use this for a knowledge-sharing system. I'd say, great, just download the tar file. They'd say, well, it doesn't have these features that we need, these 20 features. And I'd say, well, you got the source code and the documentation. And they'd say, we want you to make the changes. I'd say, that's going to take me a month, and I'm trying to finish my PhD here. No, we need you to make the changes. And I'd say, how many programmers do you have? I'd say, 10,000. So you got 10,000 programmers. I'm just one guy. What do you want from me? They said, we'll give you $100,000. I said, you give me $100,000 for a month of work? They said, yes. So then I thought, maybe there's a business in this. It turns out, in the last talk we heard about selling time. If you control what goes into the next release, you can make about 3 times as much money as just selling time. So we controlled what went into the next release for everybody so that they wouldn't be, have this really weird version that would be hard to upgrade. So I ended up with a company with about 80 programmers, about $20 million a year in revenue. Photo.net became too hard to run, so I spun it off to some MIT geniuses who were going to make a fortune selling ads on the site. And I went and kept running. And I decided I wasn't really capable of running this company because I wasn't a business guy. So I brought in some venture capitalists, and they immediately kicked me out. They said I didn't know anything. So I sold the company to them, and I went to the flight school and learned to fly, loaded my dog in the back of the airplane. By the time I got to Alaska and back, I came home, and they'd pissed away $50 million and gone bankrupt. It's like I made a profit every month when I was running this company. How hard could it be? But they ignored a lot of our ideas, and they started to lose some money. So I don't know. Recently, I took Photo.net back over. Actually, last summer, I've been trying to update it a little bit and improve the software. But it's still kind of an interesting area. I don't think it's been a completely solved problem. So like I said, I'm going to take questions in a minute. I think we still have 15 minutes left. But let's see. What am I going to talk about at 2? Give you a brief ad. Basically, we're going to give it's a technical talk, but it can be, I think if you're going to manage programmers, it will give you enough background to know what it is that they're supposed to be doing. So you'll learn a little bit about HTML, a little bit about SQL and the relational database and why it's important, a little bit about designing interaction, and also about the architecture, what people seem to have converged on for how many servers do you need, what do they run, how do you connect them together, and the most productive software development styles. So anyway, that's going to be at 2 o'clock in the little room for the loser speakers. So, questions. Who's got a question? And people should talk into the mic, otherwise it will not be streamed over to the internet, though I can repeat the question back.
Hi, thank you very much. Is this on?
Is it on?
Okay. No?
Yeah.
Okay, my question is about creating these online communities and the idea of not having anonymous access to these communities, because that logically makes sense, that there's that sense of accountability and responsibility. But now, my question is, if you have, as part of the requirement of creating this community, this assurance to the people who are part of the community that they can remain anonymous because of potential sensitivity around their comments, is it still possible to create sufficient sense of accountability that you're not going to get vandalization of that community?
I don't think I heard all of it, but it was about. So first of all, Photo.net allows anonymous access, right? You can read anything. We just don't allow anonymous postings. So what's the question? Is it for
more? The question is really about how to create a community where people can log on and that they are feeling part of this community, so there is possibly some avatar which they're using, but which at the same time is sensitive. So let me take an example of, let's say we've got particular judgments which we are posting on our website, and we want lawyers from different countries to be able to pass comment on this. The problem is that the governments of these particular countries for which we have judgments may feel like they don't like these comments. We want to protect the identities of the...
Right. Yeah, I understand. I think, for certain communities, like for Internet Spanking Forum or, a gay community or something, you might not want to use your real name. I know I don't. You see a couple, do not ask them how they met, because the answer is always incredibly boring, like they were introduced by friends, or it will be humiliating, like they were in an Internet Spanking Forum. So basically, never ask them how they met. I think you need tighter moderation. Like on Photo.net, we have problems with nudes sometimes. People upload images that are not very high quality, but they're very naked indeed. We're not against nudes per se, but the aesthetics have to kind of carry the nudity. We're not trying to be Playboy magazine. First of all, it's not a photo sharing system at Photo.net. It's intended for people who want to improve their craft. So there's 2 million photos that people have uploaded, but it's really more for critique and so forth. So we don't want them just to upload a Playboy centerfold type picture. For us, it just makes life a lot easier. If they're using their real name, they're less likely. They're not going to upload child porn if they're identified to their real name and their address, because the FBI will come right to their house. So a lot of things become easier. I think if you have tighter moderation, people could have kind of an authentic screen presence. If you authenticate them down to IP address and you have a lot of it's just going to raise your administrative burden, I think, quite a bit if you can't get people's real names. But, I absolutely agree. In a lot of kinds of communities, photography is something where, it's not embarrassing. So we can just get people to use their real names. Next.
Hi, I'm interested to know what you think of the Delicious model, so the tagging clouds and...
Of the what?
Delicious.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting. Almost everything that's successful on the Internet, I built, and everybody said it was stupid. So I couldn't get, so everybody at MIT, all the professors said I was an idiot. They were right, of course. But when I was in grad school, I wanted to build Internet applications, and this was 1993. And they said there's nothing interesting that will happen on the Internet. And there's nothing to research. And everything interesting was proposed and solved in the 1960s, the packet transport protocols and so forth. And they said Internet will only be used for read-only. Like basically, the way Tim Berners-Lee had initially used it was to distribute documentation and physics papers. And they said that will be the only use of this web thing. So then in 1995, I was at Hearst setting up the Hearst magazines, or Hearst Corporation Web Services, and they had all these newspapers with classified ads. And I said, what you really need is a classified ad system where people register, and they have a reputation, and they can post an ad, and there's bidding, so you can auction something if you want, or sell it for a fixed price. So I built it for them, every feature of eBay. And they said, this is terrible. It'll never work. We don't want it. And I said, well, can I take the code and run it on Photo.net? And they said, this code is so bad, you can do whatever you want with it. We don't care. So I launched it on Photo.net, although it was specific to photography, so it didn't catch on like eBay. Delicious is the same thing. We thought, a lot of communities would want to share bookmarks. So we actually put that into our open source toolkit. And if you'd wanted to launch Delicious in the year 2000, you could have done it without writing a single line of code, although you would have then have had to add tagging because we didn't have that. But you could do a full text search among all the bookmarks. So we had the bookmark, a text description. I guess that was tagging, essentially. And then we had the Oracle full text indexer running through that. So I guess I thought it was a good idea because we stuck it in the toolkit. I don't know why it didn't catch on. It didn't really catch on with the Photo.net users. I don't know how much we promoted it to them. So, yeah, I think... all that stuff is kind of interesting. I just don't understand why. I can never figure out why something catches on. Never ask an engineer for advice on investing because they'll always think that something that should work will work next year, but it actually won't work for 5 or 10 years in the marketplace.
Do you have any
teen and child online communities?
Protecting teens. Okay, so the question is any insight or advice for protecting teens and children. That's not really an area that we've looked into because at photo.net we just say in the terms of use this is, a site for adults basically, and, it's not about pornography, but there may be nudes and, there may be raw language. Credit card verification I think is the most one. The assumption that kids don't have credit cards, so if you can run a $1 charge on somebody's credit card. That might be tougher in Africa. Oh, yeah. We didn't have, the question is, like, if it's a site for kids, how do you keep the sexual predators out of MySpace? No, I don't know how to do that. We did have a clever idea for naughty words, though. We ended up with, my friend Cleantes, the physicist, came up with this. We decided that we would, for every word in the dictionary, we could decide, we would take a 32-bit bit mask, and we could decide, we could have G-rated at each bit. It could be G-rated, PG, R, X, and then we could have other ratings, like for people who they didn't want their kids to learn about a particular topic. We could mark words for that particular topic. And then for every posting, as it went into the database, we could take all those words and we could OR them together and come up with a combined bit mask for the entire posting. And then for every child reader, then we could have a bit mask for them, and we could AND that with the postings bit mask, and very computationally efficiently we could figure out, okay, this posting is too naughty for this kid. So their parent doesn't want them to see this, and then we would exclude it from the page when we did the database query. So that was one little technical idea. Thanks, guys. Anyway, so I'm